If there's one thing people love, it's a story about failure. Of course, we do love hearing those stories about the underdog who beats the odds, or when the noble hero defeats the big evil and wins the day. But let's be honest, we love it when things go wrong. Let me put it to you this way. Have you ever seen one of those lists of the top 10 greatest movies ever made? I guarantee you'll disagree with them in some way. What do you mean Citizen Kane is better than The Godfather? Why in God's name is Titanic on here, but none of the Lord of the Rings movies? Who the fuck even likes Avatar? But let's be honest, if you see a list like that, most of the time you're going to skip past it. But a list of the top 10 worst movies of all time? Now that's different. You might not agree with every single choice on that list, but you're not going to be upset if you see movies like The Suburban Sasquatch or Birdemic on there, are you? And I think this is because of a very simple thing. What we see as good is subjective, but bad is always universal. And that's true for almost anything. Music, art, clothing, cars. What you like might not be what I like, but we can all agree on what sucks. And planes are no exception. Here's a fun game you can play if you're ever in a group of aviation fans. Ask them, what was the best fighter of World War II? I promise that within an hour, you'll be breaking up a fist fight. But ask that same group, once they've calmed down a bit and you've cleaned up all the blood, what the worst fighter of the war was. While they might not all have the same answer, I don't think they'll disagree with each other. However, to me, there's a bit of a unique aspect to planes. Even a bad plane can be undeniably cool. I mean, a giant thing made of metal flying faster than anything evolution has ever come up with, despite millions of years to do so. Flying so far and so fast that the body cannot even cope with the time difference. Powered by the remains of ancient flora and fauna long since past. It seemingly breaks all laws of nature. It's like something out of Lovecraft, albeit with a lot less racism. What I'm trying to say is, planes are cool, even crap ones. So, with that in mind, what are some of the most rubbish, cool planes ever made? First, there are some ground rules for this. Number 1, no paper projects. It had to have actually been a plane that was actually built. So no German 1946 Wunderplanes. Number 2, it had to have actually flown. So no wooden mock-ups, no scale models, and no prototypes that never even managed to make it to the air. So no XF V12s or F4Xs. So, with that out of the way, let's look at 4 of the coolest worst planes ever made.
Now, where the fuck are you?
No, stop! Not that way! That way lies fucking old Bristol town.
Doesn't sound like a very popular place, does it?
In 1953, the UK government issued Operational Requirement 330. This was for a proposed Mark III reconnaissance aircraft that would eventually be developed into the Avro 730. Okay. I realise now that in my last video I didn't actually explain what Mach was. Mach is the number given to the speed of sound. The speed of sound being 760 miles per hour or 1,225 kilometers per hour at sea level. To put some scale on those numbers, a Boeing 737 passenger plane makes around Mach 0.8, making it subsonic. Something like an F-16 can go Mach 1.6, and Concorde famously could go Mach 2. Anyway, back to the video. The Avro 730 would have been an 8-engined, 50-metre monster. However, before they could even begin building the 730, they had to do some testing. Remember, this was still the early 50s, so not a lot was known about speeds beyond Mach 1. What stresses would the plane be under? What would you even build it out of? So they decided to build a test plane to work all this out. Enter Bristol. The Bristol Airplane Company was founded, funnily enough, in Bristol in 1910. They spent both wars building fighters and bombers, and by the end of World War II they were one of the biggest plane builders in the UK, so they were an excellent choice to build an experimental airplane. It would be called the 188. It was designed to fly at Mach 2 speeds for prolonged periods to gather data on what effects prolonged high-speed flight would have on airframes. But first they had to develop new methods to even build the thing. You see, at speeds greater than Mach 2.5, it was expected that the industry standard aluminium construction wouldn't last at high Mach speeds. So Bristol were going to have to build a plane using a titanium-infused stainless steel alloy, and also have to develop a new way to even weld this new material. This took 2 years alone before they could even start building the plane. But by 1960 they had finally finished building the first flying prototype, and after 3 years of ground testing, it took to the air on April the 26th, 1963.
And then the problems started.
First, even to take off and land in the thing was very difficult. It had a takeoff speed of nearly 480 kilometers an hour, and a landing speed of over 300 kilometers an hour. That takeoff speed is a full 100 kilometers an hour faster than an Airbus A380, a plane that's nearly 3.5 times bigger than the 188. The second problem was its fuel consumption. Fitted with 2 incredibly thirsty de Havilland Gyron Junior turbojets, it spent most of its fuel just to get up to altitude. Flight time in most cases was 20 to 25 minutes. Not 20 to 25 minutes at supersonic speed, mind you, but 20 to 25 minutes total. The third and biggest problem was that it was way slower than intended. Instead of the Mach 2.5 speed it was designed for, it only ever managed a max speed of Mach 1.8. In early 1964, flight testing was cancelled. The 3 prototypes, 2 flying and 1 airframe used for ground testing, were taken to a test range and used for target practice. Thankfully, one of them, XF926, was rescued in 1972 to be used as an instructional airframe for cadets, and is now at the Air Force Museum in Shropshire. And while it was a failure for gathering data for the Avro 730, which incidentally was cancelled in 1957, 4 years before the 188 even flew, it did gather enough data to help with the development of both the TSR-2 and Concorde, so not a complete failure. But why do I think it's cool? I think mainly it's because of the era it belongs to. There was a brief time after World War II where British aviation was on the top of the world. We had a lead on both the Soviets and the Americans, and were pumping out interesting design after interesting design. Your Gloucester Javelins, Blackburn Buccaneers, English Electric Canberras, and of course the awesome V-Force. And while our lead was very short-lived, it's still an amazing testament to Britain's ability to innovate despite having very little in the way of money post-World War II. And I think the 188 is a great representation of that era, when Britain was on the very cutting edge. The Soviet Navy, with the exception of the submarine force, was hilariously inept during the first 50 years of its existence. This wasn't helped by the utter destruction of the preceding Russian Navy during the Russo-Japanese War, the massive upheaval caused by the Russian Revolution, and a heavy focus on land and air forces during World War II. However, by the 1970s, thanks mostly to the efforts of Admiral Gershakov, things had started to turn around, and while they never quite reached the same strength as NATO or the US naval forces, their anti-ship missiles were a true threat to NATO. And they'd even gotten round to building their first aircraft carriers. They had planned to build aircraft carriers since before World War II. However, they never got beyond the design stage. But, in 1970, they finally managed to start building one. Sort of. The Kiev-class ships weren't traditional carriers as we know them. First, they weren't actually called aircraft carriers, they were called aviation cruisers. This is because any aircraft carrier over 15,000 tons were banned from passing the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Strait, thanks to the Montreux Convention. This means it wouldn't have been able to enter or leave the Black Sea. Now, this is an issue because the Soviet Union's main shipbuilding facilities were based in Ukraine, which is in the Black Sea. And second, they didn't have a full-length flight deck, due to the forecastle being filled with both anti-ship and anti-air missiles. This meant that while they could easily launch helicopters, they couldn't launch normal airplanes the same way American aircraft carriers could. But the Soviets really wanted the fighter to fly from their carriers. Mainly so they'd have some way of intercepting enemy planes that might try to attack the carrier or even locate it, but also as a way to earn bonus propaganda points in the never-ending dick measuring contest that was the Cold War. So the solution? VTOL, or vertical takeoff and landing. No, I don't know why they didn't include an A in that acronym. Now, this wasn't a completely ridiculous idea. France and Germany had spent the 1960s building VTOL prototypes to mixed success. And Britain had actually put one, the Harrier, into production. The Soviets had even flown a VTOL prototype themselves, the Yak-36. So, a year after the first Kiev carrier hit the water, they were putting the finishing touches to their new high-tech fighter, the Yak-38. Or, as it was known in the West, the Forger. Looking at it next to the Harrier, you can sort of see why it was called that. And it was terrible. The biggest issue was its engine, or engines, plural. You see, unlike the Harrier, which used a single massive engine to both lift the plane vertically and propel it horizontally, the Yak-38 relied on not only a single engine with rotating nozzles, but 2 extra engines just for lift. This means that not only do you have extra cost, complexity and maintenance, but also means that when you aren't using those engines for vertical flight, they're just dead weight. Also, the lift engines they used, 2 Rabinsk RD-38s, were ridiculously unreliable. They had a service life of about 22 hours, which, to put into perspective, the Pegasus engine of the Harrier had a service life of over 3,000 hours. In fact, so little faith was put into the lift engines that the Yak-38 was fitted with an auto-eject system that would go off if either of the engines failed or the tilt of the aircraft exceeded 60 degrees. Oh, how very confidence-inspiring. But despite that, how did it do in service? Not great, it turns out. On its first voyage aboard Kiev in 1976, although they had 6 planes on board, only 3 were operational. And by the end of the voyage, only 1 was actually airworthy. Pilots reportedly hated the plane, due mainly to its tendency to want to kill its own pilot. In fact, nearly a third of Yak-38s were lost to accidents. Although, unlike a lot of other failed aircraft, this one did actually see combat. Briefly. You see, a squadron of Yak-38s was sent to Afghanistan in 1980. This was because it was theorised they could take off and land on relatively short, poorly maintained runways. However, when they first arrived, they discovered that the Forger was probably the worst plane you could have ever picked for the environment. First problem was, the engines hated operating at the high ambient temperatures in the area, and sometimes wouldn't even start. When they did start, flight time was as little as 15 minutes. The second problem was its strike capability, or lack thereof. At most, in these hot and high environments, they could only carry 2 100-kilogram bombs. Now, I know 200 kilograms sounds like a lot, but the equivalent Harrier of the time, the GR-1, could carry up to 2,000 kilograms. After only 12 missions, the Yak-38 was recalled. and the type itself was finally retired with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So why is it cool? Well, I like to think there's a simple rule when it comes to aviation. Planes are cool. Helicopters are cool. VTOL aircraft are uber cool. I mean, just the sight of a small plane seemingly floating invisibly is unquestionably amazing. Like something from Star Wars or the MCU. So even if the plane in question was truly terrible, and make no mistake, the Yak-38 was incredibly bad, it will still stop and make you gasp whenever you see it. Unless it was the Yak-38U, the two-seat trainer. Because...
Good, good. I hear you're a racist now, Father. What? How did you get interested in that type of thing?
Okay, so, quick disclaimer. I am not a Veraboo. I have to make this statement because I know whenever you hear some bloke on the internet talking about German equipment of World War II, that there's a higher than average chance that person has complicated feelings towards Nazi Germany. You see them in every comment section on every World War II video on YouTube. If the Me-262 had arrived a year early, the Nazis would have won the war. The Tiger tank could destroy 100 Germans for every Tiger lost. The Soviets only won the war because they used horde tactics like the orcs in 40k. And so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. They are exhausting. Because even if you try and talk about the good stuff Germany produced in World War II, you either end up in an argument or looking like that one vicar in Father Ted. However, I don't think I'm going to upset anyone when I say this. The HE-162 is quite possibly the worst fighter ever made. The HE-162 was a product of pure panic. By the autumn of 1944, Nazi Germany was falling on all fronts. In the east, the Soviets were blasting their way through Poland. In the west, the Allies were just about to set foot in Germany itself, and every day and every night, German factories were being pummeled into the ground. When it came to the air war, Germany just couldn't keep up. American factories were pumping out bombers and fighters at an incredible rate. That meant for every plane Germany shot down, another 2 could take its place. Germany didn't have anything near that production capability. Even during the height of their success, they were constantly trying to keep up with the demands of the Luftwaffe. Add to that, the new complex fighters such as the Me-262 and Me-163 were absorbing a lot in the way of raw materials. So when the shit started hitting the fan, Germany was left defenceless. The other problem was manpower, or rather, trained manpower. Whilst in the first few years of the war, Germany had numerous highly trained and experienced fighter pilots, by 1944, most of them had either died, been maimed, or been captured. So all you had left were young, poorly trained recruits being sent in to fight with poorly maintained, out-of-date planes with very little training. They needed a solution. Surrender unconditionally and try and prevent a total destruction of your nation and people? Of course not. Build another complex fighter jet. On the 8th of September 1944, Luftwaffe High Command issued the Emergency Fighter Program. The program issued orders stating that all production of piston-engine aircraft would immediately stop, except for the DO-335 heavy fighter bomber. Production of the Me-262 would be prioritised, and a new single-engine fighter would be designed and built. The single-engine fighter had to be built using cheap materials, be easy to build by unskilled labour, that could be so easy to fly that a quickly trained member of the Hitler Youth could pilot it. A true Volksjäger, or people's fighter. Many aircraft companies submitted their proposals, including Messerschmitt, Junkers, Arado and Focke-Wulf. But eventually a design from Heinkel, makers of the HE-111 and the truly awful HE-177, was chosen, And oh boy, did Heinkel work fast. From their design being picked on the 25th of September, the prototype aircraft took to the air on the 6th of December. That's only 72 days. To put that into perspective, the comparatively simple Hawker Hurricane took 3 years to design and build, 1934 to 1937. The design was very unique for the time. It had a single engine located in a pod on top of the fuselage. This made it easy to design and modify the plane should you want to fit a different engine type or design. Although due to this location, the plane had to be fitted with an ejection seat, one of the earliest planes to do so. This is because bailing out of the plane in the traditional way risked the pilot being sucked into the engine. It would be powered by a BMW 003 turbojet and would have a top speed of 840 km an hour. That's a full 130 km an hour faster than the American P-51D aircraft patrolling the skies over Germany, all while armed with two 20mm cannons. So on paper, this is a decent aircraft. But wow, did the 162 need more time in the oven. Although the fuselage was made out of aluminium, the wing, nose and landing gear doors were all made out of wood. However, the glue they used to bond all this wood together was of very poor quality. And after the landing gear doors fell off after the first flight, it was discovered that the acid in the glue was eating away at the wood, the same glue that held the wings together. To remedy this, they continued flight testing the prototype, which of course eventually crashed, killing the test pilot. But they literally didn't have time to stop, so they just continued testing with the second prototype, and quickly discovered a rather big issue with the plane. You see, the plane had quite the potential performance-wise, but it took a highly trained pilot to get the most out of the aircraft. Remember, this was meant to be piloted by Hitler Youth trainees, who at most had training on a glider. By January 1945, production planes began to make their way to squadrons for evaluation. Some squadrons were forced to trade their ever-reliable FW-190s for this brand new plane, seemingly made during an episode of Art Attack. Flight testing was limited by both lack of fuel and poor maintenance, so it wasn't until May 1945 that some planes were ready for actual combat. At which point, the airfield they were based at was captured by the British. The HE-162 never once fired its guns in anger. Some claim that one shot down a British fighter, but there's no actual evidence to prove this. British test flights, flown by our Lord and Saviour Winkle Brown, confirmed what German test pilots had learned. The thing had potential, but the idea that a young pilot could fly the thing to anything close to its potential was downright ludicrous. So, if it's so terrible, and was built by literal Nazis, why do I think it's cool? I think the answer's twofold. First, it was a genuinely innovative idea. A single-engined, small, light fighter with an ejection seat? Sounds like something closer to an F-16 or MiG-21 rather than a fighter from the 1940s. And second, this thing is an anti-racist weapon. Now, before you shout at me in the comments, let me explain. For every single one of those planes built, it took dozens, if not hundreds of people to design, build and maintain. Not to mention the resources it took to build. Resources that couldn't be spent on making guns, bullets, tanks or other more capable aircraft. All for something that didn't even fire a single bullet at another enemy plane. Hell, this thing should be waving the Antifa flag whilst singing Bella Ciao, it's so anti-fascist. And of course, as we all know, there is nothing cooler than punching a Nazi.
Teacher, I don't understand why we have to have the results of our assignments in miles. The rest of the world just uses kilometers, and I think it'd be easier to...
Okay, so this is going to start sounding familiar. America had been the first nation to break the sound barrier in 1946 using the Bell X-1, and through rapid development and modifications had pushed the X-1 to over Mach 2. But there were some issues with the X-1 and its eventual successor, the X-2. You see, despite the fact that the X-1 and X-2 were very successful aircraft when it came to researching supersonic flight, there were a few issues. The first issue was it was rocket-powered, which meant it needed highly dangerous fuel to operate, and in some cases, this fuel led to the loss of both man and machine. Second, it couldn't take off under its own power. It had to be carried under the belly of a B-29 bomber, and it usually took a couple of hours for the aircraft to reach the correct launch altitude. The third issue was flight time. Whilst it took hours for the aircraft to reach altitude, the X-1 only had a burn time of 280 seconds, which means you do get a lot of data when it comes to how to actually break the sound barrier, but no data on how prolonged supersonic flight might have an effect on an airframe. So, in 1949, the US Air Force, US Navy, and NACA, the precursor to today's NASA, jointly ordered an aircraft to test prolonged supersonic flight. It would be a jet-powered aircraft built from exotic heat-resistant materials, be capable of taking off and landing under its own power, and capable of Mach 2.2 speed for prolonged periods. Yeah, this is starting to sound a lot like the Bristol 188 again, isn't it? Although to be fair, this all happened 10 years before the 188 even flew. So, in reality, it's that rare case of the British ripping off the Americans. Douglas was chosen to build the prototype, and the prototype itself would be called the X-3 Stiletto. And it was a stunning thing. It was also very long. At full length, it was over 20 meters long. It would also be one of the first aircraft ever built, mostly out of titanium. It certainly made the X-3 lighter than the stainless steel 188. It was powered by two Westinghouse J34 turbojet engines, the same aircraft that powered Douglas's F-3D Skyknight night fighter. First flights happened in 1952. And it was quickly discovered there was a problem. Like, a huge problem. It was slow. Anemically slow. It couldn't even break the sound barrier in level flight, only in a dive. But why? Wind tunnel tests proved it could easily break the sound barrier, and could easily make it to Mach 2. So what gives? Westinghouse. Westinghouse Electric had been building energy generators since 1886, but in 1945 they decided to have a crack at gas turbine production. And while they did have some mild success with their J30 engine, they weren't exactly world leaders. But when it came to the J34, they truly excelled themselves in awfulness. For aircraft like the Douglas Skyknight and the North American Buckeye, it was fine. But for any aircraft even getting close to the sound barrier, it was hopeless. The Convair F2Y Sea Dart, for example, much like the X-3, couldn't even break the sound barrier in level flight. And the Vought F7U Cutlass, well, it was so hopeless and underpowered that it resulted in a near 30% crash rate for the aircraft. So, why didn't they fit a better engine? Well, they did try from the drawing board. It was meant to be powered by the ever so slightly less shit J46, but the J46 ended up being too big to fit inside the X-3, and any attempt to fit a better engine from someone like General Electric or Rolls-Royce would have required major redesign of the internal structure. So, they were stuck with the asthmatic hairdryer. Testing showed that top speed in level flight was only Mach 0.98, or 1,100 kilometers an hour. In a dive, it just about managed Mach 1.2, or 1,470 kilometers an hour. Add to that a cockpit with terrible forward visibility, a near 420 kilometer an hour takeoff speed, and a downward firing ejection seat. It made the X-3 a rather terrifying thing to fly. In fact, the singular airframe was nearly lost when the pilot was performing a high-speed maneuver and the plane nearly entered a flat spin. The pilot did recover the aircraft, but in doing so, the plane reached its maximum G limit and very nearly broke up mid-air. After that, the plane was permanently grounded. Thankfully today, the X-3 still exists. It now lives in the National Museum for United States Air Force, based in Ohio. And while it didn't provide any data on supersonic stresses, it did provide some useful data when designing the F-104 starfighter, which is either a blessing or a curse, depending on who you ask. Now, I could sit here and explain why I think it's cool, but I don't think I really need to explain myself, do I? I mean, look at it! It looks like it's from another planet. This thing could have been lifted from the pages of Flash Gordon. If I told you to draw a plane with the singular brief of being fast, you'd draw this. Let me put it another way. You know how some of the guns in Star Wars were just old World War I Lewis machine guns? The filmmakers knew that Lewis was a futuristic looking gun, despite being over 50 years old when the movie was made. I feel the same way about the X-3. I feel like you could just drop the X-3 into a Star Wars movie without a single modification, and no one would notice. And to me, that's pretty cool. So, those are my picks. But what do you think? What planes can you think of that are cool but terrible? Also, what about the inverse? What planes can you think of that are absolutely amazing, but are actually quite dull? Do please let me know in the comments. Anyway, thanks for watching, and have a nice day.